It's time for Health Talk with Peter Christian and John King. Every Monday morning from 8:30 to 9 here on Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 101.5 FM. Sponsored by Community Medical Center. From day one.
All right, welcome everybody. It is this edition of Health Talk. We're privileged to have with us, first of all, the fabulous Dr. John King right over there.
Well, good morning, Peter.
I'm not sure what your specialty is.
Well, I can apply children's pants to 3-year-olds. It's very difficult in the morning, but it takes me a little bit of time, but I'm able to do it. I've mastered that.
But you've had experience with 2 other individuals.
That's right. So the kicking and fighting, I can get around that.
There you go. All right. Dr. Bill Huvel is joining us this morning as a general surgeon, originally from Louisiana.
Yes.
So what in the world?
All right.
Now, what in the world brought you to God's country here in
Well, the
in
same
Missoula?
thing that would bring y'all here. I mean,
Yeah.
you kidding? The opportunity to change a lot of children's diapers. You can go from there.
It's a good
I mean,
start.
I got to learn
Good start.
from John how to do that exactly. I didn't know that was part of the prerequisite.
Hold him
here.
down with one hand.
Just have liked Montana for a long time. I knew some of the surgeons here years back, and I used to work in Louisiana at the time, and they contacted me and said, would you be interested in working up here part-time from time to time, covering trauma surgery and acute care surgery at one of the hospitals here. So, and that was in 2003. So I'd been up to Montana. I knew some families up here, and like the Townsend area, actually. I mean, to me, Missoula is the big city. I mean, my introduction to Montana was Townsend.
Well, there you go.
And so when I came to
to
Missoula, I was awestruck by all the big buildings.
Right. Well, Townsend is just a suburb of Towson, you know. So
Well, wait a minute now. Excuse me, sir. We have a blinking light in Townsend.
Okay.
No.
Moving on up.
Are we here to talk about medicine this morning?
Absolutely. But I wanted to get a little background.
Yeah, I came to, and loved Montana. My wife loves Montana. She's a pediatrician, and she's worked from time to time. And I've worked both in Missoula and the Great Falls area. Worked at Benefice as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I've lived for the most part in Montana since 2003, and love it,
All right.
And so you said you do trauma care and acute care.
Yeah, you didn't want to meet me. You didn't want to meet me as a doctor.
So when someone meets you, they're in trouble.
Yeah. I did covered through mostly weekend coverage, and did all anything that came in with trauma and any acute care surgery that needed to be done. And I did a Benefice as well for years.
So the types of trauma you see in Montana, are they different than you experienced in Louisiana?
Yes.
What sort of things stick out to you as kind of different here?
Well, I mean, let's start. For instance, horse-related trauma. That is not the horses having trauma. That's actually people getting thrown off horses.
Or kicked.
Or a horse that I have sat on.
Exactly. And, but, I mean, you see a lot of that here. They have a horse trauma registry at the hospitals here, and it's the largest horse trauma registry in the United States.
So are we just really bad horsemen here? Or
It was after I went off the horse the third time that I wanted to look into this a little bit deeper.
Yeah. Because if people remember, Christopher Reeve brought a great deal of
absolutely
awareness to this when he became a quadriplegic.
That's one tragic part of it. And actually, I have seen that spectrum and the worst you can see from horses. But you see a lot of minor or moderately minor horse-related injuries. But the interesting thing is, because we went over and reviewed 2 years of data from this horse registry. We've given some presentations, and that was way back. I haven't looked at it lately, but the interesting thing to me was that greenhorns and people who considered themselves riders or cowboys went off the horses at exactly the same percentage, 50%, because greenhorns would get on a horse and they would literally just fall off if the horse sneezed.
Right.
Whereas a lot of the riders would get on and do things, on horses they probably shouldn't be doing, and, at rodeos and, bucking horses, et cetera, et cetera. So it was interesting that half the people in this data bank were not greenhorns. They were actually experienced riders.
Mm-hmm. I learned to ride from a cow horse that we purchased from a guy, from a rancher up in Silver Star. His name was Mickey. He was like 12 years old, and he taught me how to ride, because when I would get on, I was like 12, 13 years old. I was an idiot. And every time I'd do something stupid, quite literally, he would very gently buck me off. And then he would stand there Do you want to get back on?
Yeah.
So I learned how to ride, but it wasn't one of those really wild deals where he'd throw me 100 feet in the air. It was just kind of go, whoop, and off I'd go. So,
But well, back on track, though, you were asking the question,
Yes.
Is trauma different here than other places? Well, you have a lot of ATV trauma, a lot of horse-related trauma, as mentioned. Also, a lot of blunt trauma, automobile accidents. Whereas in big cities like New Orleans and other places that I've tended to, and in South Florida was where my surgical practice was for 20 years. A lot more penetrating trauma, a lot more gunshot wound stabbings and things like that. But I will say this, it's an excellent trauma system. When I got up here, I was surprised by the sophistication of the trauma center. And I'm talking about from the picking the patients up pre-hospital to hospital to disposition, even if we had to go to Seattle and Harborview, and the relationships we had, the flight crews, the trauma teams, at the hospital here. It was very sophisticated, a very pleasant surprise to me when I got here.
So what made them sophisticated compared to what you had experienced?
Very organized. The pre-hospital flight crews, being in Montana, you're spread out, multiple small emergency rooms, et cetera, all over the state. So you have the helicopters flying almost constantly on busy weekends from both hospitals, and it's just very organized, very sophisticated. That I found from where I was coming from, where I thought West Palm Beach, Florida, would be, how can you get any, but coming to Montana, I found it very advanced, very sophisticated.
Well, I will tell you, some of the best doctors in the world want to live here. And so
that's why I'm here.
Yeah, there you go. See,
that came
He's
out,
on the best doctors in the world registry.
That came out wrong, don't it? That was a leading question, people. That was a leading question. But the trauma is a little different here, and it's very well handled. But that was my introduction to Montana.
Well, that's great. But one of the reasons that you're here is to talk about the hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And I really we're going to take a quick commercial break. If you have a question for Dr. Huvel, give us a call at 721-1290. All 4 of our lines are open, whether you want to talk about surgery or this is a very interesting topic we're going to get into. So we'll be right back.
Maybe we can put Peter in the chamber and he can report live from the inside the chamber for the rest of the show.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll be right back.
Rob Quist isn't telling the truth. First, Quist lied about his 16-year trail of unpaid taxes and debts. Then he lied about being a Montana hunter. But state records show Quist hasn't had a hunting license for over 16 years. Quist lied.
We're busy. I wish you guys could share what we talk about during the break.
It took us longer than expected to open up the hyperbaric chamber.
Anyway.
Get Peter back out.
All right, so let's talk about the specialty wound care. Well, folks do.
You talk about wounds, and then we'll talk about starting at the basics of wounds, okay? And when you talk about wounds, there are 2 major categories about wounds. And being a trauma surgeon, I've seen a lot of wounds in the acute phase. What we talk about the acute phase is when it's happening. When it's happening the first couple of weeks, where people get a traumatic wound or any kind of wound, okay? So that's an acute wound. After a month, wounds become what we call chronic, okay? And at that stage, people will call it wounds, skin ulcers. It's really the same thing, same terminology, but it kind of enters into a different phase when we enter chronic wounds. And that's what a wound care center's real strength is most people should heal a wound. And if not heal a wound within a month, okay, should at least have it more than 50% healed. If the wound is not at least 50% healed, there's problems there. There's some kind of underlying problem that this person is not healing this wound. Okay, now that's not to say every wound you have is going to heal in a month. Don't get the wrong idea. But most wounds in an average person that aren't huge, very complicated wounds should be close to healed, if not well on its way to being healed in a month. The chronic wounds are what we're talking about. And there's usually an underlying issue with these wounds, and that's where wound care centers nowadays, over the past 15 years, have made huge strides, okay? Because what we found out is this leads to a lot of morbidity. When people with open wounds, one way or the other, leads to a lot of morbidity and a lot of amputations, okay, which leads to further morbidity. And then you're talking about mortalities, okay? So the wound care centers, number one, if you talk to anybody, what are you trying to do in a wound care center? It's trying to save people's legs. We don't want anybody to go to an amputation, okay? And in that course, over the past 15 years, there have been a lot of adjunct therapies, a lot of new therapies that have come forward. and a lot thought put into, this taking care of wounds, because it's a huge burden on the American economy and how much money we spend on people with unhealing wounds, and certainly going on to amputations. The other thing is, with the rise in diabetes in the United States and the longevity of people's lives, we're finding that there are more patients today with chronic complicated wounds. So that's where wound care centers come into play, and that's where hyperbaric oxygen comes into play, because it's really the newest bullet we have in our armamentarium.
Could you explain what that term means, hyperbaric?
It is literally putting people in a tank, and I want you to think it's a closed tank, because these tanks actually are pretty much mostly hard acrylic, and you can, it's an open tank,
Okay.
but
All right.
and it's pressurized. Okay, that's the one part of it. It's pressurized, and it's the equivalent. If anybody's a diver here,
Right.
I'm a diver. If you've dove, we live at 1 atmosphere pressure. So if we had 1 square inch of air column going up to the top, it would be 14.7 pounds of pressure in that square inch, which is 1 atmosphere. We live at 1 atmosphere pressure. If you're a diver, or if you're going into one of these hyperbaric tanks, okay, every time you go down 33 feet when you're diving, that's another atmosphere of pressure. So we take these people down just like they're diving to a total usually of between 2 and 2.5 total atmospheres of pressure, which is the equivalent. If we take them down, and we take them down slow, we take them down at 1 psi, 1 pound per square inch a minute, and usually we take them down to 2.5 atmospheres. Say. That's the equivalent of 48 feet of water. And if you're a diver, that's a significant pressure change. So it's there's a lot of science there. You have to know dive tables, actually. And issues with ears and things like that, clearing ears. Not everybody is a candidate, but for the most part, it's very safe, and most people are.
What is the benefit of the extra pressure?
Pressure is added to the next component, which I was getting ready to get to, which is oxygen. There's under 100% oxygen during the majority of their time at the bottom of this tank, dive, we call it, or in the tank. So this is actually, and that's the beauty of it, it's oxygen under pressure, which brings in Boyle's law. Now, I don't want to get too complicated here. Peter's looking at me like, okay, no.
Sounds
He's
good
getting
to
out
me.
his 8th grade physics textbook.
I'm
And that's
I'm
about
loving
as far
this.
as we're going to go with this. But suffice it to say that not only does a person, exposed to 100% oxygen is under pressure, the bubbles of oxygen actually get smaller. And so what it does is it literally infiltrates the skin, infiltrates this person's body with oxygen.
Gotcha.
And that's the number one thing that promotes growth factors, a lot of factors from your own body. It wakes your body up.
And it promotes healing. Yeah.
And promotes healing. And oxygen itself is utilized for superoxide radicals and other things that help fight bacteria. There's a myriad of things that it's beneficial for. But it's quite as patient needs to make, it's 30 dives usually to 50 dives. So that they have to make, what would be the word, Peter?
They have to make a commitment to get this done, right?
Thank you. They have to make a commitment. But I tell you, in very chronic, complicated wounds, the benefits can sometimes be very striking.
Can I ask you, how did they discover that this thing that only divers are concerned with would help to treat wounds?
Well, it was pretty much of a natural thought that, with hyperbarics and 100% oxygen and Boyle's law, it's got to be beneficial. And you're looking at some of these people, and part of the problem with these wounds are they're not oxygenating this wound well. Okay, and they're not getting the growth factors they need in there. So how do we do this? And so it was pretty simple science to promote it. And that was the thought. Now, they are probably 11 to 13 indications for hyperbaric oxygen that are recognized indications. Other people will try to treat certain illnesses with hyperbaric oxygen, but that's very experimental. But we're very focused on what we treat with hyperbaric oxygen and the wounds that we treat with hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Diabetics that have had significant infections with their wounds, a deep diabetic wound, respond very well to hyperbaric oxygen. That's a perfect example of why, because diabetics have problems with not only their large blood vessels, but also their smaller blood vessels, okay? So even if they're getting blood down to the foot, say, it doesn't get to the wound as well because the small microvasculature is usually affected with diabetes.
They're
as
shut
well.
down, right? Yeah.
Therefore, then if you put hyperbaric oxygen on this patient, it will infuse that wound area with oxygen. So,
Now, what success rate do you have with this?
well, overall, I mean, that's included in our whole clinic. And that's the beauty of what we're doing here is that Community Hospital has partnered with the largest entity for wound care in the United States, okay? So while we're in Missoula, Montana, we have contact with the world's, and we take care of, this entity takes care of over a third of the chronic wounds in the United States. There's over close to 900 facilities. So it's a huge data bank. It's a huge thought process. We have a lot of backup, a lot of people helping us with the tough cases. So in answer to your question, and I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of treatments, the success rate is 92% in the chronic wounds we get.
That's fantastic.
And that's not just Missoula, Montana. Our rate is right there at 92% as well. And the average heal rate, taking everybody, is just under a month, 29 days. But, we're here to treat the total patient, too. And patient satisfaction and patient's comfort is a large part of this as well. So,
Well, we're up against the break. Go ahead, John.
Well, you had mentioned diabetics a lot, but that there were 13 types of illnesses or wounds that
Right.
you would recommend for this hyperbaric treatment. What are some of the others?
No, we're very specific. There's a lot of things we don't treat. And let's take a perfect example. We don't, anybody with the bends, or people who understand nitrogen toxicity, we're divers. We don't really even treat that. Of course, there's a lot of that in Flathead Lake, I'm sure, from people diving, but not really. You don't get much of that in Montana. But there are indications with treating certain things like carbon monoxide toxicity and things like that. We don't really treat that. We are focused on wounds. The type of wounds we treat are wounds that are deep, have involved infection, diabetics, that involve the bone infections, osteomyelitis, and radiation injuries. Radiation wounds, okay, are very complex, very hard to treat. And hyperbaric oxygen is proved to be very beneficial in the effects of radiation injury.
Okay, and we're going to come right back with after this quick timeout. This is fantastic. This is fascinating stuff. If you have a question, again, all four of our lines are open at 721-1290. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back. 721-1290 is our number. This is Health Talk, and we're talking with Dr. Bill Huvel, who is as a general surgeon from Louisiana, but he's at Community Medical Center. We've been talking about wound care, and I understand. Let's get to the open house right away. So tell us when and where the open house is.
Yeah, this is a relatively new wound care center. There's been a wound care center in Community Hospital for years, but we've actually expanded. We have our own little facility, which is right there on campus, especially to support the hyperbarics. The team we have, I just want to mention them because they may be listening on the radio, so I'm in trouble. But no, we really have an excellent team. Okay, this goes well beyond wound care and as far as taking care of patients. As a group, they've had more than 60 years experience. So it's a very good team we have there, maybe excluding present party. But anyway, no, very good.
We have some of the
and
team in the
program
hall.
director, and Greg, our program director. But no, we have an excellent team. The open house is like I said, we've recently partnered with this entity so what we have, since we have our own new freestanding facilities, we have an open house on June 8th for everyone, and it's going to be food and beverages, and people want to come around and ask questions, see the hyperbaric chambers, to see what we do in wound care centers, because I don't want to it's not just hyperbaric. As a matter of fact, hyperbaric is almost the last line. Hyperbaric's an adjunct to things that you do before then, which are crucial to wound care, including making sure the vascular inflow is good, okay, making sure that venous outflow is good. And we don't have to get into a lot of things, but nutrition. If they're diabetic, that they're managing their diabetes, that if this wound is on their feet, that you take pressure off the wound while they're walking, okay? If they have edema, that you limit the edema, because you can imagine edema decreases oxygen and growth factors as they try to get to this open wound. So there's a lot of things that go into effect before we ever consider a patient eligible for hyperbaric. There's a whole thing, and you take care of the patient first, okay? And we try to heal the wound first. But if a wound can't heal, even with these magic girls that I have working for me, okay, then they become candidates for hyperbaric. And there are other things to use nowadays. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was curious. You're an acute trauma surgeon,
Right.
which is one end of the spectrum of wound care. And then you're talking about the hyperbaric chamber, which is kind of like the far other end,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Late in the wound's life cycle.
Exactly.
And you do both? Or do
No,
some of your magic girls do one end or the other? I mean, how does this work?
I don't do trauma anymore. I don't do, that's a young man's game, as I like to say. And, and after so many years of doing, 30 years of doing surgery, people say, well, don't you miss that? And it's like, I have that T-shirt and it has holes in it. So no, not so much. And it has been, and like I said, I get a lot of support from my team. It's different. It's different being an acute care surgeon, taking care of acute care problems, and you have a different mentality when you're taking care of chronic wounds. You got to take care of the patients. You got to optimize all of the patient's comorbidities. Okay, and that's what we've been talking about. And there are other things other than hyperbaric. They have a whole myriad nowadays of skin substitutes that we can use that go across the board. I don't even want to tell you what some of these things are because but the latest and best, just to give you an idea, is placental products. Okay, and they have a couple out there that use actually placental material because if you think about it, when you're talking about growth hormones,
rich with
stem
nutrients,
cell,
right, yeah.
anything growth.
Right.
I mean, there's nothing more than the placenta.
Right.
That it contains all these factors. And this has really been done. It's interesting because I was reading some articles back in the 1960s when they first started doing this. They used to actually go over to labor and delivery and steal some of the placentas out that they can do when they were doing experimentation. You can't do that nowadays.
Okay, now we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
So I need to tell us about this again, and then how and where can we contact you and get more information about what's going on? So
well, yeah, it's open house. It's at the community wound center and hyperbaric center. Okay, it's a freestanding facility right next to the cancer facility there on the campus at Community Hospital. It's June 8th, 5 to 7.
okay,
Just June 8th. Food and beverages. Any questions? Anybody wants to come around and see hyperbaric? I don't know if we'll be able to take anybody down for a dive or anything like that at that time, but be glad to have anybody come by that has any questions. If you want to contact me, it's at the Wounds in the Hyperbaric Center. The number is 327-4514.
it's been a pleasure, sir. Thanks.
My pleasure.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
being
having
with
me.
us.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to come back and have talk back when we come back.